Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Debbie Gaudette, and I am in charge of events and special programs. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk with Megan O'Neill. And Megan is going to talk to us about an object, an Olmec figurine that Pierre Matisse sold to the Wadsworth in 1937. Megan O'Neill, Assistant Professor of Art History at Emory University and Faculty Curator at the Michael C. Carlos Museum at Emory, received her PhD in History of Art from Yale University. A specialist in the ancient Maya and other cultures of ancient Mesoamerica, Dr. O'Neill also studies the reception of Mesoamerican art and culture over time, including histories of collecting as well as artists' engagements with the art of the ancient Americas. So before I turn over the talk to Megan, I just want to mention that the museum is open. We are open on Fridays from noon to 8 p.m. and Saturday and Sunday from noon to 5 p.m. So Megan, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I'm really happy to be giving this talk, but sad that I can't be at the museum, because if I were, I would love to be in a gallery with this wonderful figurine. I do want to thank a few people before beginning. Thanks to Debbie for coordinating, and also to Eric Bowen, who's disappeared but is running the tech. And I also want to thank Jana Israel for inviting me to give this talk, as well as Casey Mallinckrodt, one of the conservators at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, for answering a question that I had, as well as Renee Stein, the chief conservator from the Carlos Museum, who helped me think a little bit about the material of this figurine that I'll show you. I also want to acknowledge Brandy Culp, who is the curator of decorative arts, as well as Vanessa Sigalis, who is here at the talk, who I know installed the figurine and researched the figurine for the Kunstkammer exhibition, where this figurine is displayed at the Wadsworth, and I hope to see that sometime in the future. And last, I also want to thank the staff at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York, because I'm using some materials from their archives from Pierre Matisse. So this talk is about the global journeys of an extraordinary figurine from the Olmec civilization in Mexico that's at the Wadsworth Athenaeum. It is only 4 inches tall. It's very small, but it has this incredible presence. I want to think about it briefly in its ancient context, but the talk really focuses more on its 20th century history. Its purchase by the Wadsworth Athenaeum in 1937 from the art dealer Pierre Matisse, son of painter Henri Matisse, is representative of a moment of growth in the pre-Hispanic art market taking place in New York City and in Paris, where this market was mixed with that of modern European art and with African art too, during a time when non-European arts were being reconceptualized as art, quote unquote, and valued for aesthetic qualities. Now, the Wadsworth Athenaeum's purchase of this figurine and other items from Mexico and Peru is also characteristic of a time between the 2 world wars, in which artists, collectors, and museums in the US were expanding their collections to include ancient items from Latin American countries, again, reconceptualizing those as art and adding them to their collections. And in addition, it also entered the art market at a time of changing understandings of ancient civilizations in Mexico, including that of the Olmec civilization and its potential relationship to the Maya, at the time a better known and defined ancient civilization. We see these changing understandings inherent in the identifications given to the figurine in the 1930s and subsequent interpretations of what it represented, which track with changing interpretations in scholarship about Olmec art and religion. And for this talk, I'm using unpublished material from the Pierre Matisse archive at the Morgan Library and some materials from the files of the Wadsworth Athenaeum. And I want to emphasize this is very preliminary research written literally just for today, that I hope to continue working on because it connects to other research that I'm doing on the Los Angeles art dealer Earl Stendhal and the larger market in pre-Hispanic art in the US in the 1930s and 40s, which I'm also doing with colleagues at the Getty Research Institute, which has formed the Pre-Hispanic Art Provenance Initiative. In researching these dealer archives, whether it's Stendhal or Matisse, as well as others, and learning more about object itineraries, I hope to shed light on these stories that have been forgotten and to better understand how many pieces left Mexico and entered museums across the world. So let's begin with this piece's physical qualities. Now, all images and publications that I can find just show one image of the front of this figurine. But to really understand it, and I'm taking some archival photographs from the Pierre Matisse archives, you really need to look at all sides of it. And I hope that you can go to the second floor of at the Wadsworth Athenaeum to see it from all sides. It's really a dynamic sculptural form. It's an anthropomorphic figure made of a dark, shiny stone. Its head, which is large in proportion to its body, has a downturned mouth, almond-shaped eyes, and a fleshy face, which is characteristic of many Olmec-style faces on ancient figurines, here compared with figurines that were excavated at the site of La Venta in Tabasco, Mexico. Now, after this figurine entered the Wadsworth Athenaeum's collection. Now, this figurine holds its arms forward with palms down. The legs are parallel, and from the front, it looks like he might be squatting, but from the side, we see he is sitting. Now, hopefully those of you who can visit this guy in the gallery can see him in the round and really appreciate this incredible, dynamic, very small figure. Now it's carved from the mineral hematite, identified by its properties such as its gray, lustrous surface. The identification of hematite has accompanied this piece since 1936, or probably earlier. That's the earliest record that I've found so far. And it's the only known Olmec carving from this material in figural form, either anthropomorphic or zoomorphic. But hematite and other iron ores like magnetite and ilmenite were used to make mirrors and beads by the Olmec, including carved mirrors. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, this little round form in this picture is an Olmec mirror that was buried in an offering cache at the site of La Venta in Mexico, along with jadeite celts or axes, which they would bury in these cross shape or cruciform shapes as centering devices. And the shiny nature, both of the carved jadeite, which you can't see in this picture because it's a black and white excavation photo, but hopefully you can imagine it, but also of the polished hematite. The shiny reflective nature was really an important aspect of both of these materials for the Olmec. And these designs in this cruciform shape was about creating centering devices that also related to maize and agricultural growth. The jadeite axes or celts are understood to relate to corn, incredibly important in Mesoamerica. Now, scholars have noted the careful grinding using abrasives to make and polish such mirrors. And they also have holes for suspension, likely to be worn as pectoral ornaments, as you see on this figurine that is made of jade, but it has a little circle of hematite, as if it's a mirror pendant that this figure is wearing. This was found in a tomb by archaeologists at La Venta. And the fact that these reflect light would have been a crucial aspect of their ancient value. Those who wore them essentially reflected light, a sign of divinity. Lumps of hematite also were deposited as offerings with carved wooden busts and other offerings in the bog at El Manatee, which is dated from about 1200 to 1000 BCE. And showing the importance of the mineral form of hematite. And so just to give you an idea of the importance of the material from which this figurine is made. Now, this figurine would have been created using drilling, and you can really see that with the holes in the face where the artist left those drill holes visible, which is common for the Olmec, in which they're really sort of playing with the tools and materials and showing what was used to create these materials. And it was also used to, so drilling as well as using abrasives for polishing. And this piece is, and all of the mirrors made out of the hematite mineral are very, very shiny and many, many hours of work for polishing. Hematite also was used as a red pigment by the Olmec and many other cultures. And what's interesting, I was contacting both Casey at the Wadsworth Athenaeum and then our conservator at my museum, the Carlos Museum, to say, how do we really know it's hematite? Do we need to test it? And our conservator, Renee Stein, said it sure looks like hematite. And the way to tell would be to do what's called a streak plate test, which I'm not suggesting that you do, because you have to rub it against an unglazed porcelain plate. And it leaves a red streak. And Renee, our wonderful conservator, did this for me with a piece of jewelry that she had in her house. And what's so interesting is that past descriptions of this piece have, oops, sorry, I realized my notes are covering the camera. Past descriptions of this piece have talked about the reflective surfaces that related to water and the supernatural. But after talking with Renee about this, I wonder if this fact that this mineral hematite also makes this red streak would have been an important aspect of its ancient value, as if it is a living figure that bleeds red blood. That's just a guess, who knows, but was inspired a little bit to think about that after talking to Renee. Now, it's clear from this figurine style that it is from the Olmec civilization, and here is a map showing major sites in the Mexican states of Tabasco and Veracruz. But we don't know where it was made or where it was deposited by the Olmec. Now, many mirrors made of hematite have been found at La Venta, and but also hematite objects have been found in other locations, as I've mentioned before. And the figurine itself, has been compared to some sculptures from San Lorenzo and Potrero Nuevo, located here, which I'll show you later. So my guess is it may come from around the site of La Venta, which is a period when they were making these small scale figurines out of jade, but we just don't know. Or maybe someone out there has a better idea, and I'm open to their suggestions. So, but it's unclear where it exactly came from, but I will tell you that that missing information is a common problem in pieces that went through the art market, for which much information was either forgotten or stripped from the pieces. But regardless, it undoubtedly would have been a valued item in its original setting. Now, we do have much more information about its modern history. So as Debbie mentioned, the Wadsworth Athenaeum bought this figurine from Pierre Matisse in 1937, and that has been in the museum records since 1937. But archival research has revealed more. Papers in the Morgan Library archive reveal that in 1936, Matisse obtained this figure from a gallery called Art d'Assy, the Parisian gallery of the poet and art dealer Charles Vignier, who died in 1934, but whose family kept the business going. Vignay was primarily a dealer of Asian arts, but he also sold arts of multiple regions of the world. And in 1913, so 24 years before, organized an exhibition of his collections at the Galerie Levesque in Paris of ancient arts of Asia, China, Korea, and Japan, as well as Iran, Syria, and Egypt, and African art, and what he called Aztec art. And this was one of the first exhibitions to mix objects of non-European arts, and also the first to call them quote unquote art, a turning point for the market in these areas, including for African art, as scholars such as Yael Barreau at the Met Museum have discussed. And Vignay supplied dealers in New York like Marius de Zayas in 1919, and later Pierre Matisse. But at the same time, the items from the Americas were not fully understood. This is 1913. And here we have, I just want to point out these two down here, which are identified as Aztec art Aztec. One of them, it says it comes from Chile, or Chile, which is completely impossible. I think what happened is that somebody at some point used an abbreviation for Chiapas in Mexico. And then someone else interpreted that as Chile and put that in this catalog. Because what I think is that these two pieces, or maybe this one, if not this one, were Olmec pieces. This one made out of jade, both of them made out of jade. And from the descriptions, I think that they were Olmec pieces. It would take some more research to figure that out. And post-COVID, hopefully I can go to Paris to do that research. I don't know when Vignay acquired the hematite figurine that's now at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, but when his gallery communicated with Matisse about it in 1936, it was identified simply as coming from Mexico. What's interesting is it wasn't giving an Aztec designation. So I think that the gallery had learned something by then, but it was still identified as coming from Mexico. So Matisse received this figure from Vignay on consignment in 1935 or 1936, along with other Mexican items. And Matisse had taken other items on consignment from Vignay in prior years. And what's interesting is that with that, he was a young dealer and he didn't need to pay upfront with these pieces on consignment. And what I've been able to track is that Matisse actually, on the same day, essentially, that the Wadsworth Athenaeum agreed to buy the piece, he recorded it as buying it from Vignay and then selling it to the Wadsworth Athenaeum. So it was essentially just, he was the middleman. But what's interesting is that when he gives the provenance information to the next, he was giving it to someone at the Baltimore Museum of Art, he just said private collection in France and then highlighted his own gallery. So as if that previous dealer's name did not need to be a part of the history of the piece. And he also said elsewhere that he was really proud to have owned this piece. And what's interesting is that those kinds of omissions, for whatever reason they take place, are ways that we lose information about pieces and their itineraries. But fortunately, with archival research, we can uncover this, and hopefully more will reveal it. So we see in the history of this piece a moment in the transatlantic art trade in the 30s between Paris and New York, when Matisse was developing his business with the help of dealers in Paris who were willing to consign the pieces to him. And other dealers like Charles Raton, a very famous dealer in Paris, were also working with Matisse. And sometimes they would say who the previous owner was. So you have the dealer in Paris, but you have also their source. One piece that Vignay was trying to sell to Matisse came from the photographer Paul Haviland. Other pieces seem to have come from Porfirio Diaz, who had been the dictator, president in Mexico for many years. So we have these clues to these longer histories of pieces, but unfortunately for this one at this time, I can't find that information, but hopefully we will be able to find that. But anyway, just to emphasize the moment in which this figurine was acquired, when these kinds of pieces were being determined to be quote unquote art and collected and traded along with modern art. And that's something that's really crucial. Here is a book from the Pierre Matisse archives. And what's so interesting is here he has it set up. It's like an address book. It is an address book. And where you see pages that are Mexico, Peru, but also Picasso or Calder or Moreau. So we literally mixed into the pages of his art business. And then also on the other side, the museums who were buying these pieces were also primarily interested, from what I can tell, in the modern art, but then also dealers like Matisse were saying, well, what about this piece, right? And that also relates to artists' interests. So the surrealist artists, for example, that Raton was working with in Paris, as well as Matisse as well in New York, were interested in arts of the Indigenous Americas, whether ancient or more recent. So thinking about modern art and ancient art together. And so that's also something that we see with this figurine. And there is a telegram from Matisse to Chick Austin, A. Everett Austin, who was the director of the Wadsworth Athenaeum at the time, in which Matisse mentions this hematite figurine and a Picasso nude in the same breath. So the same letters, the same documents. Also, one interesting thing is on the left is the list of items that the hematite figure in the stock book of Pierre Matisse of the acquisitions. You can see Moreau, Giacometti, African, so a piece of African art, Dufy, Matisse, Renoir, Mexican, that's the hematite figurine. Or the page of sales that the hematite figurine appears in the stock book is also a list of major contemporary modern artists at the time, and then also with a little bit of ancient Mexico and at times African art mixed in as well. So again, we see these major trends of collecting and also the way that artists, collectors, and museums were looking at this piece at the same time. Okay, now, oh, sorry, here I had a picture of you, though those of you at the Wadsworth Athenaeum will know much more about Everett Chick Austin than I will, who was communicating with Matisse about this figurine and who decided to purchase it at the same time. Now, when Matisse, let me just check my time, when Matisse was communicating with Austin as well as with other collectors and museums, he was emphasizing the rarity of access to such figurines. And I just want to quote a couple. In one letter to a California collector, Wright Ludington from 1935, he says, since it's been impossible to export anything of value from Mexico, fine works of art of the pre-Columbian period have become very rare. Once in a while, I am able to secure from old European collections some of the pieces which have been brought over and have been able to build up a very fine collection of figurines and semi-precious stones. So this is we have similar letters to other museum directors. I haven't found anything quite yet that with Austin, but I'm sure he was talking about that because he wasn't at that time getting things directly from Mexico, but from Europe. What's interesting is that because of World War II, Matisse and Stendhal began to look in the Americas for more sources of this materials, and accessing pieces directly from Mexico. But at this time, around 1937, he's looking to these European dealers. Okay. Now, I also, let's see, hold on a second. I just want to show you just a couple of screenshots, and I don't have access to the full Wadsworth Athenaeum database. This just comes from a search to see, like, what did they buy in 1937? There's a lot more. But in addition to this figurine in 1937, there were a few other items from ancient Mexico. So it was also a time when the Wadsworth Athenaeum was interested in expanding their collections. And I have found the record of purchase of this item. So Matisse bought it for about $2,200 and sold it for $5,000. So he made quite a profit from this, which I think encouraged him and excited him about this. But I do think that this was one of Matisse's really big acquisitions of ancient Mexican art that I'm not sure if he ever got something so interesting, or that he also expressed this passion for this particular piece, which, as I said before, he says, I'm really proud of this piece. And what I also found is that this piece was also involved in changing interpretations of Olmec and other cultures of ancient civilizations of Mexico. So we now know that the Olmec were one of the earliest civilizations of Mexico to make figural art, monumental sculptures, and architecture. But at this time, Olmec was just beginning to be defined. And when Vignier's gallery showed this or consigned this piece to Matisse, again, I said before, they didn't identify it as Olmec. What happened was Matisse showed this piece to George Vaillant, who was the curator at the American Museum of Natural History, who said, let's see, as Matisse described in a letter to Everett Austin, the origin of this figure is linked by Vaillant with the Olmec tribe, semi-mythical people of Veracruz district, and great mystery to the Mexican archaeologist. So we see there that language of trying to understand, even calling them semi-mythical. There just wasn't full information, and the archaeology was just beginning. And I also want to note that this moment of 1937 is 2 years before the founding of INAH, the National Institute of Anthropology and History in Mexico. So there's movements within Mexico to formalize archaeology, and it's with that where they begin to learn more about the Olmec and begin to figure out the chronology. What's also interesting about Vaillant's involvement is that Vaillant gave his blessing for this figurine, which is something that he did for dealers in New York often, where they would show it to him and he would say either it's a falsification, a modern forgery, or it's an ancient figure, ancient piece. And Vaillant gave his blessing for Matisse for this. Actually, a few years later, Matisse bought some Teotihuacan style masks, and then Vaillant deemed them falsifications, which was a huge blow to Matisse, financially as well as personally. And he writes about that in his letters in the archive. But because Vaillant gave his blessing for this piece, then Matisse moved forward and, as you all know, sold it to the Wadsworth Athenaeum. But I want to tell you a little bit more about the idea of Olmec at this time. Again, so much was changing. Okay, so there was, they didn't understand the chronology of Olmec. So people like Vaillant were able to identify what they saw as an Olmec style in figurines, some of which were appearing in museums. The American Museum of Natural History had some, Berlin had some as well. And so, and also there were some in museums in Mexico as well. So excavations were carried out at La Venta and other places. This is a 1940 article from National Geographic in which they're starting to define who were the Olmec, but still not quite sure of the chronology. And you have Mexican scholars such as Alfonso Caso, who become the first director of INA, the National Institute of Anthropology and History, and also Miguel Covarrubias, the famous artist, Mexican artist, who's very interested in the Olmec. And they were starting to say the Olmec are the mother culture. They're the earliest ones. They start to say that around 1942. And now we essentially know that is true, though the idea of a mother culture is debated, but that chronology is now clear. But at the time, it wasn't. And what's so interesting is that what we're also seeing in the archives is that Matisse really wanted this figurine to be in a Maya exhibition that was at the Baltimore Museum of Art in 1937. The director of that museum had contacted him and said, hey, do you have any Maya pieces? By the way, this I think is the first exhibition of just Maya art in the United States. So a significant moment in the history of exhibitions of the art of the ancient Americas. And so Matisse responded to the director of the Baltimore Museum and said, you got to have this piece. It is one of the most beautiful examples of Olmec culture. And then McKinney, who's the director, responds saying, well, I don't understand. Why would you want this? We don't want, this is just a show about the Maya. And Matisse says, but the Olmec derived from the Maya, essentially. So he's actually getting it wrong, but he's getting it right. There is a connection between the Olmec and the Maya. He had the chronology wrong, but again, interested in this connections of cultures and trying to understand them. I do think Matisse was really interested and really passionate from this material and trying to figure out and engage with scholarship. Now, inclusion of the figurine in that show was deemed inappropriate. They said it's not Maya, it's not relevant, and Matisse had to lend another piece. But the piece was, the hematite figurine was desired for other exhibitions, and it was displayed in a pretty important exhibition at the Fogg Museum at Harvard University in 1940. Here it is, figure hematite, lent by the Wadsworth Athenaeum, in which it is called Olmec style. So as I mentioned before, Vignier did not identify as Olmec, but in those few years, them identifying as Olmec, and then its first publication, as far as I know, in which it's called the Olmec style. So again, with just this small history of this very tiny 4-inch figurine, we also see these major trends in collecting, in artists' engagement with ancient Mesoamerica, and also with archaeologists and scientists in the US and Mexico who are interested in these materials. And their presence in museum collections is how people got to know them before you have excavations at places like La Venta, which are talked about in National Geographic and in other fora. Okay, so I just want to show you very quickly, here is another Olmec style figurine that was at the American Museum of Natural History before this hematite figure, but it is the one at the Wadsworth Athenaeum is one of the earliest. They're not quite the earliest. So just to show you, I know I have to wrap up soon. That the piece was in a number of many publications and exhibitions because it was unusual at the time. It still is unusual, I have to say. Here it is published in Paul Kellerman's 1943 Medieval American Art, which is this major survey of the art of ancient Americas. There's the figurine. What's interesting, he calls it a pyrite here. I don't know why or what he based that determination on, but as far as I can tell, the conservators all think it's hematite. They haven't done that streak test, which I don't think they'll do. But anyway, it was also published in Miguel Covarrubias's book, Indian Art of Mexico and Central America, where you can see it here. And what's interesting about Covarrubias's work here is that he calls it, and I hope you can see here at the bottom, a hematite dwarf of unknown provenance. And this is the first moment that I can tell in which this figurine is referred not to as a seated man, but the word dwarf is used in relation to it. And Covarrubias is making this interpretation in relation to sculptures like this from Potrero Nuevo, Monument 2, in which these dwarf-like figures are holding up the earth. And this is also a throne for the ruler to sit on. And Covarrubias in that book also talks about other figures like this and talks about supernatural dwarfs that are mediators between humans and the supernatural, also connected to rain, agricultural fertility, and to corn as well. And from what I can tell, it's because of Covarrubias's book, then in the 1958 Wadsworth Athenaeum Handbook, they began to call it a statuette of a seated man and described as a squat dwarf-like male figure. So undoubtedly responding to Covarrubias. Now, the piece traveled to Europe in 1959 and 1960, exhibited in these exhibitions that were organized by there were two exhibitions, one by the art dealer in Los Angeles, Earl Stendhal, and one by Fernando Gamboa, who was a very important curator, museographer in Mexico, who had the National Museum collections traveling in Europe. At the same time, Stendhal had pieces for sale traveling, as well as ones from private collections and museums. And the hematite figurine was in this exhibition, at least when it combined in two cities in Europe. I think that, and I'm still trying to figure this out, that it was in the Stendhal exhibition, so in the one for the dealers and sale items. But what's interesting is that the Wadsworth was very generous to share with me some materials from the object file. And in there, Fernando Gamboa asks to borrow the figurine for a couple more venues for his exhibition, the Mexican National Collection. Unfortunately, the Wadsworth Athenaeum said no, they need it in their gallery for fundraising purposes. So it didn't get to join that Mexican show, which I find unfortunate, but I guess it had been traveling in Europe for several years and they wanted it back in their galleries. But subsequently, the figurine was exhibited in other exhibitions, including ones done by Princeton and the National Gallery of Art in the 1990s, where the attribution of a seated dwarf becomes, I would say, even fixed about the objects. And I believe that is the label that is used for the Wadsworth Athenaeum. It's on the website, etc. So we also see that transition of how these are being understood. Now, just what's also really interesting about there's some letters in the object files that are trying to get the Wadsworth Athenaeum to think about, well, have you looked at this in a medical sense? Like, what kind of pediatric disease is this showing? The responses from the curators at the time were like, we don't know. We don't have any specialists on our staff. That was particularly at that moment. But there's also been, it's sort of a more general trend for Olmec studies in which people are looking at other figurines of these squatting figures and identifying them with medical terms, including some that are referred to as fetuses and fetuses in different development. So I find it interesting that, again, yet another of these trends in scholarship, this little hematite figurine is involved in. Also, I just want to show you connections to maize in these figures. So this is what is believed Carl Taube has identified as the Olmec corn god that's shown as a baby And we see the cycle of corn death and rebirth. And so the dwarfs that are shown in these figurines are most likely related to that cycle of corn. And we see for the Maya, the maize god who dances with a dwarf, who is a very important figure in corn narratives of the Maya, or here on this jade plaque from Nabac, Guatemala, also Maya, in which we have a ruler in relation to a dwarf who's coming out of a supernatural cartouche. These are supernatural figures, mediators between humans and divine, associated with corn or associated with rulership. So I just want to summarize, just thinking a little bit more about the changing names and movements of this figurine, connect with larger contexts of scholarship about the Olmec, and also with the vicissitudes of the art market at this time, as the understanding of the piece was contextualized in its moment and modified over time. But what I find very interesting, and I haven't been able to see the piece in its current installation, but I've been told that at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, it's put into a Kunstkammer, a collecting cabinet in the museum, which is this incredible, dramatic installation of objects, as well as natural history specimens from around the world, recalling collecting practices from the early modern period all the way to the 20th century. And I find it actually quite interesting because for this piece, we know more about its 20th century history, its history of movement among museums or people or display in museums than its actual ancient history. So in a way, that display contextualized as a museum piece in museum history seems quite appropriate, even though this particular piece wouldn't have been in one of those early modern cabinets, since as far as we know, it was not known about until later. Though I will say there are pieces that were in very early Kunstkammers that were then, when those Kunstkammers were split up, ended up in other collections and maybe in places like the British Museum or other museums. So just to summarize, just to think again about 1937, this important moment in Mexico right before the founding of the National Institute of Anthropology and History, understanding more about the Olmec, and also thinking about history of the time. 1937 is a moment also when the dealer Julius Karlebach had to flee Berlin because of the Nazis establishing a gallery in New York. And because in subsequent years, we see the growth of the pre-Hispanic art market in New York as it is suppressed in Europe because of conflict, but also probably as it's fed by more objects because of that conflict, as people have to disperse their collections, which is another topic that I hope more scholars can get into and understand that. Anyway, I think that's all I want to say. I want to thank you for your attention, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Dr. O'Neill, thank you so very much for sharing your knowledge with us today of these Olmec objects, but also this Wadsworth figurine. It's such a fascinating story. So thank you very much. I do see one question, and again, if anyone has a question, please add it to the chat box, and I will read it. And also, just as Professor O'Neill, Dr. O'Neill mentioned, you can see this Olmec figurine in Morgan 2 in the Kunstkammer room. All right, so hi, Jana. This is from Jana Israel. Great talk. You may have said this and I may have missed it. Have these figurines been found outside of the burial context? Do the objects found with the burials speak to the social status of the deceased? Were excavations in this region receiving a lot of press in the early 20th century? did these Olmec figurines inspire any artists in the 1930s or later to use those forms or materials in their own work? Wow, that's a lot.
Thank you, Jana. And I'm very glad Jana's here. Jana and I were postdoctoral fellows at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art many years ago. So it's great to revisit. That was probably 10 years ago. My goodness. Okay, so where do I begin? There are, I think, 3 questions embedded in there. So let me back up. So here's a figurine that was found in a burial at La Venta. And what's interesting is that I would say, yes, they do reflect the social status of the deceased. This is a burial that was found in the ceremonial record of La Venta. And the archaeologists suggested that, so this is a female figurine, that that the burial was of a female, and that perhaps this is a portrait or depiction of that individual buried in there. So we do have some figurines that were found with burials with human funerary remains with ancestors, but then also in offering caches. So this comes from what's called offering 4 at La Venta, where there were figurines of different types of greenstone, including jadeite, but none of hematite, and also a sandstone figurine, where this was not with a burial. This was an offering cache that actually created sort of a tableau in which I didn't bring in a picture. The figures were actually looking at each other and set up as if in an architectural environment. And what's so interesting about this offering is that it was buried, and then floors were covered it, several floors. And then it looks like 100 years later, someone opened that, looked in, and reburied it. The archaeologists were able to tell that. So there was memory of where this burial had been. Now, so this little figurine could have been in a burial of, a human burial. It could have been an offering cache. It also could have been transferred around as an heirloom object. We also have Olmec figurines and masks that were held onto. There was a Maya burial from the 8th century with an Olmec figurine that would have been from 900 to 400 BCE, that was buried in a Maya tomb in Guatemala 1,000 years after it was made. That was excavated by Michelle Rich, who's a curator at the Dallas Museum of Art. And also the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan of Aztecs also has one Olmec heirloom in there. And then the last piece I want to mention is what's called the Kunstachs, which is at the American Museum of Natural History, was found in the 19th century in Oaxaca. So pieces were also, later on in Mesoamerica, Olmec pieces were valued by other later civilizations. So we just don't know whether this piece was, continued to be used as an heirloom or kept on, or if it was deposited by the Olmec and then dug up by someone in the 19th or 20th century. We just don't know. So it could have been any of those. Okay, so were excavations in this region receiving a lot of press in the early 20th century? So not until the 1940s. Excavations at Cerro de las Mesas and Tres Zapotes were in the late 1930s, so 1938 and 39, and then at La Venta in 1942, in which, yes, they did receive quite a bit of press, from what I can tell, though that's not my particular area of expertise, though I'll look it up after. So your last question, did they inspire any artists in the 30s or later to use these forms or materials, hematite, in their own work? That's a question I don't know, but I hope somebody will look at. The Maya were of interest in the 30s in architecture. I don't know, I'd have to ask Jay Oles, who is at Wellesley College, not terribly far from you, if anybody was making materials from those. So I should also mention that Matisse was also in touch with contemporary Mexican artists at the time and selling their work, and he was communicating actually with Rufino Tamayo about this particular hematite figure, and Rufino Tamayo encouraged him to write directly to the National Institute of Anthropology and History to the museum at the time in Mexico, National Museum, to ask for advice. So artists were aware of this. Miguel Covarrubias was a collector and owned Olmec figurines. And I think people have shown that his looking at Olmec and other works inspired his art as well. So I think the answer is yes, artists were inspired, but in different ways. Did that answer all your questions? Those are really good questions.
All right, our next question is from Mary Miller. Hematite equals iron ore. Where does the material come from, and is it a common material?
Okay. Hi, Mary. Mary was my PhD advisor. Is this like an exam or something? So that's something I need to, iron ore is very common, and hematite is an incredibly common pigment that we see all over Mesoamerica. And that pigment can, essentially, from what I understand, it can degrade from the iron ore. I don't know how common the hematite mineral is. My guess is that it is pretty common, but it's not appearing that often in its mineral form in archaeological deposits that I've found. So we have, and I'm sure other people know more, and I would welcome their suggestions. I know that hematite was found in some Maya sites. Steve Houston has talked about this, and also offerings at El Manatee and in the mirrors. But this figurine is the only known anthropomorphic or figural form of a figurine that's in the hematite mineral, even though hematite as a pigment is extremely common.
From Lita Marks, I saw large heads there, and are they Olmec?
So are you thinking of the picture that I showed, or is it this picture perhaps? These are, the Olmec are well known for colossal heads. This one 6 feet tall. Yes, these are Olmec. So these heads weren't discovered until the late 30s, early 40s. So those, sort of understanding this figurine as Olmec and the discoveries of these colossal heads was happening at the same time. As I mentioned, their presence, at least the way Matthew Sterling, who was a major archaeologist for the Olmec, talked about it, is that different people's discovery of these figurines in museum collections is what made them want to do archaeology of the region. Also in the 1920s, Franz Blum, who was a curator at Tulane, did a large survey in Chiapas and Tabasco, in which they started to see these large heads and others. So it was in the 20s too that they're beginning to understand or look more to these forms that eventually become called Olmec. I hope that answered your question.
All right, from Vanessa Sigalis. Wow, what a wonderful talk. Can you talk a little more about how this figure was made? How was the drilling done, and what tools were used?
Okay. Thank you, Vanessa. That's a great question. So this, you're tapping into my ignorance, right? Or you're finding the moment of my ignorance about the hardness of hematite as a mineral, which is something I meant to look up, but I didn't. So you have to have a drill that's harder than your stone. For jade, jadeite, which the Olmec were using, you have to, which is a very, very hard stone. The hematite is softer than that. You have to use drills of something that's harder, and also abrasives. The abrasives are really, really important. So they would use these. This is all, there were no metal tools. So again, they're using stones that are harder. They're using emery as well, and also those abrasives, incredibly labor intensive. I suggest the work of two people if you want to learn more about the carvings. Carl Tauba, who's a professor at University of California, Riverside, and Emiliano Melgar, who is a researcher, and I think he's a professor too, in Mexico. And both of them have thought a lot about ancient carvings of stones, but those abrasives are really important in use with the drills.
Okay, so from Joanne Pillsbury, in the later periods, artists like Barnett Newman and Michael Heiser were very interested in Olmec sculpture and sites. Terrific talk. Many thanks, Megan.
Oh, wow. It's great to have Joanne Pillsbury here, who's a curator at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And Joanne is absolutely right. And thanks for, my little brain freeze. I forgot about Michael Heiser. What's so interesting about Michael Heiser is that his father was one of the archaeologists that worked as an Olmec archaeologist, not this particular work, but so so as a child, presumably he was learning about the Olmec and also learning about these massive stones as well as burials as well. And there's a wonderful work by Michael Heiser at the LA County Museum of Art, Levitated Mass, which is this humongous rock that's levitated in the back of the museum. And absolutely, as Joanne says, inspired by Olmec sculpture and sites. And then also, of course, Barnett Newman as well, who was also a collector. So again, there's another answer to Jana's question, that artists who were collecting or artists involved in archaeology were then inspired in different ways to make their works.
Wonderful. All right, so our last comment is from Lita Marks again. She's saying that she was actually there when she asked, when she was referring to these large heads that she saw.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so so if you all want to see the most incredible collection of Olmec art in the entire world, is at the Archaeology Museum in Jalapa in Mexico. And there you can see them at the Jalapa Museum. You can also see them at the La Venta Archaeological Park in Mexico as well.
Dr. O'Neill, thank you so much for enlightening us today. It's, as I said, it's such a fascinating story, and I learned a great deal this afternoon. So thank you for being here. And also thank you to those of you who attended.